This is a retelling of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Enjoy. Ebenezer Scrooge had built himself a fortress, not of stone, though his chambers were cold enough to be mistaken for a tomb. His fortress was made of something harder, the absolute certainty that he would never again be wounded by loving anything he could lose. He had learned this architecture young, a boy left at school while other children went home for Christmas, a boy whose father's face was a closed door, a boy who discovered that wanting things that might be taken from you was a form of self-inflicted torture, and that the only rational response was to stop wanting. So he had. Systematically, thoroughly, he had transformed himself into something that could not be hurt, because it no longer hoped for anything except the accumulation of what could be counted and controlled. Money was perfect for this. Money didn't die like his sister Fan. Money didn't leave like Belle, walking away from his proposal with tears on her face, saying, "You've changed, Ebenezer. There's nothing left in you that knows how to love. Money stayed where you put it. Money grew if you tended it correctly. Money was the one relationship that rewarded you for giving nothing away." By 67, Scrooge had perfected his system. His counting house was cold because heat cost money, and because warmth invited lingering, which invited conversation, which invited connection. His clerk, Bob Cratchit, was paid exactly enough to prevent him from leaving, but not enough to suggest Scrooge valued him. His nephew Fred was rebuffed every Christmas because accepting an invitation would acknowledge that family mattered, which would mean loss could hurt again. The fortress had no cracks, or so Scrooge believed. On this particular Christmas Eve, he worked late as always, watching Cratchit shiver over the books. When Cratchit asked to leave at closing time, "Tomorrow being Christmas, sir," Scrooge heard in the request an accusation. Every mention of the holiday was an attack on the architecture that kept him safe. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December," he said, and watched Cratchit flinch. Good? The flinch meant the boundary held. That night the fortress cracked. It began with Marley, his old partner, dead 7 years, appearing in chains that clanked with the weight of cash boxes, ledgers, padlocks, and steel purses. Scrooge had always admired Marley's ruthlessness. Now he saw what that ruthlessness had forged, not freedom but bondage. Every transaction that had taken without giving had added a link. Every connection refused had added weight. "I wear the chain I forged in life," Marley howled. "I made it link by link and yard by yard." Scrooge looked down at his own invisible chains and felt, for the first time in decades, the weight he had been pretending was strength. "You will be haunted by 3 spirits," Marley said. "Without their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread." After Marley vanished, Scrooge tried to convince himself it had been indigestion, a bit of underdone potato, the mind playing tricks. But something had shifted in the foundation of his fortress. A crack had appeared, and through it came a cold wind that had nothing to do with temperature. He fell into uneasy sleep, and at 1 o'clock precisely the first spirit came. The ghost of Christmas past was a strange figure, both ancient and young, a candle flame in human shape, light pouring from its head that Scrooge instinctively wanted to extinguish. "Rise and walk with me," the spirit commanded. Scrooge found himself transported to the school of his childhood. There, in a bare room while other children had gone home for the holidays, sat a boy reading alone. The boy he had been. The boy he had bricked over so thoroughly, he'd almost forgotten that lonely child existed. "The school is not quite deserted," said the ghost. "The solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still." Scrooge felt something dangerous rising in his chest. He had built his entire life on the premise that this boy's pain was weakness to be overcome, not a wound requiring attention. But seeing himself there, small, hopeful despite everything, still capable of being hurt, he felt the first crack in his certainty. They moved through time. He saw Fan come to retrieve him, her small face bright with news that their father had changed, that Ebenezer could come home. He watched his younger self work for old Fezziwig, who threw Christmas parties not because they were profitable, but because joy was worth creating. He watched himself fall in love with Belle, and watched that love calcify as he slowly chose security over vulnerability. "Spirit," Scrooge said, "show me no more. Why do you delight to torture me?" "These are shadows of things that have been," said the ghost. "That they are what they are, do not blame me. But Scrooge understood now what the spirit was doing. It was making him see his own pattern, not from inside the fortress where the pattern felt like wisdom, but from outside, where the pattern revealed itself as a prison. He had not escaped pain by refusing love. He had only refused love. The pain had never left. It had just been walled away where it could fester rather than heal. The ghost of Christmas present was abundance itself, a giant robed in green, surrounded by a feast that seemed to exist primarily to be given away. Where the first spirit had shown Scrooge his own history, this one showed him something more disturbing. The present he was embedded in, but had been pretending didn't exist. They visited the Cratchits' humble home, where Bob raised a toast to Scrooge, his employer, his stingy master, and Mrs. Cratchit nearly refused to drink it. They watched Tiny Tim, the small boy with the crutch, who blessed everyone and meant it, whose life hung by a thread that Scrooge had the power to strengthen, but had not. "Spirit," said Scrooge with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live. I see a vacant seat in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner carefully preserved." The ghost's voice grew stern. "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." Scrooge began to understand that he was not separate from these people. His wages to Cratchit determined what food was on their table. His coldness rippled outward into suffering he had trained himself not to see. He was not a fortress. He was a thread in a web, and every thread he cut or weakened damaged the whole fabric. They visited his nephew Fred's Christmas party, where guests played games and laughed, and Fred spoke of his uncle with more pity than anger. "I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not," Fred said. "He may rail at Christmas until he dies, but I'll keep the door open." Scrooge had spent decades interpreting this persistence as weakness or manipulation. Now, watching Fred's face, he saw it for what it was, a gift offered freely regardless of whether it would be received. The ghost showed him more, want and ignorance crouching beneath his robe, warnings of what a society produces when it refuses to tend its vulnerable. But what struck Scrooge most was simpler. Everywhere he looked, people were feeding each other. Food, warmth, music, attention, love. What flowed between them was not transactional. It created more than it consumed. His whole life had been organized around the opposite principle. Take, keep, guard. What you give away is gone forever. He had been wrong. The ghost of Christmas yet to come was silence wrapped in darkness. It showed without speaking. It pointed without explaining. It showed Scrooge his own death. Not a noble death, mourned by those who loved him, but a death that prompted discussion of what could be salvaged from his estate. Businessmen wondering whether the funeral would include lunch. Servants stealing his bed curtains while his body cooled. A young couple feeling guilty relief that their creditor had died before collecting. No grief. No one tending the memory of what had been. Just a vacancy where a person had been, unmourned because unmourning was all he had cultivated. They stood in a churchyard. The ghost pointed to a grave. Scrooge already knew what he would read there, but he had to see it. Ebenezer Scrooge. The letters cut into him more deeply than any wound his father had inflicted, more deeply than Belle walking away, more deeply than the solitary Christmases of his boyhood, because those wounds had happened to him. This one he had built himself, link by link, year by year. "Spirit," he cried, clutching at its robe, "hear me. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been but for this intercourse." This was the moment the fortress fell. Not brick by brick, it collapsed entirely. Everything Scrooge had believed about the necessity of walls, about the safety of isolation, about the wisdom of refusing to love what could be lost, all of it crumbled in the face of where that logic actually led. He was on his knees before the grave, weeping. "I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach." He didn't know if he would be heard. He didn't know if change was still possible. He only knew that he could not continue being what he had made himself. He woke in his own bed. The posts were his own. The curtains had not been stolen. He was alive, and the time for undoing was not past. What Scrooge did that morning was remarkable, not for its grand gestures. Though the prize turkey sent anonymously to the Cratchits was grand enough, And the charitable donation that made the solicitor stagger was substantial. What was remarkable was the joy. He laughed. This man, who had not laughed sincerely in 40 years, stood in his nightclothes and laughed until he cried and cried until he laughed again. The sound was rusty from disuse but unmistakable. A man discovering that the chains had been unlocked all along, that he had only needed to see them clearly to let them fall. He went to Fred's house and accepted the invitation he had refused for years. He watched his nephew's face move from suspicion to confusion to something approaching wonder. "Why, bless my soul," cried Fred's wife. "Who's that?" "It's I, your Uncle Scrooge. I have come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred?" Fred would. Fred always would. The door had been open all along. In the days that followed, Scrooge became known as a man who knew how to keep Christmas. He raised Bob Cratchit's salary. He became a second father to Tiny Tim, who did not die. He gave with the same systematic attention he had once applied to accumulating. But now he was measuring something different, not what he could keep, but what he could set in motion. Some people laughed at his transformation. They called it madness or senility or a publicity stunt. Scrooge didn't mind. He had spent 67 years caring what people thought about his walls. He could spend his remaining years indifferent to what they thought about his open doors. He had learned something in those 9 hours of ghostly visitation, a night that felt like 9 nights, long enough to break and remake him entirely. He had learned that the wound he had been hiding from was not the problem. The hiding was the problem. The fortress he had built against pain had become a prison that created worse pain than any he had fled. He was not healed of his loneliness by the spirits. He was shown his loneliness clearly, allowed to break against the clear sight, and then discovered that broken open is not the same as broken. The crack where the light came in was also where the light went out.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for more. Share to help the channel grow.